Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling a heavy but a really crucial topic: gender-based violence.
Yeah,
And you might be thinking, isn't that just violence against women?
right.
But get ready for some eye-opening insights because, as we're going to find out, this issue it impacts individuals of all genders.
That's right. And our deep dive today is going to take us through a stack of sources, exploring this complex issue from all angles. The history, the shocking global prevalence, the devastating consequences, and even how our understanding of what constitutes violence has evolved over time.
Okay, I gotta admit, prepping for this deep dive, I was left with some serious questions. Like, how did we even get here? What are the deeply ingrained practices that perpetuate this violence? And most importantly, what can we do about it?
Those are all excellent questions, and luckily the sources we have really dig deep into those areas. For example, did you know that the UN didn't even have a clear definition of violence against women until 1993?
Wait, really? 1993? That seems so late.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But it really highlights how long it took for this issue to be recognized and defined on a global scale. You know, this UN definition is actually a pivotal moment in our journey of understanding gender-based violence. It states that violence against women is any act of gender-based violence that results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual, or psychological harm or suffering to women, including threats of such acts, coercion, or arbitrary deprivation of liberty, whether occurring in public or private life.
Okay, that definition, that's way more comprehensive than just physical assault. It includes threats, emotional abuse, and even the impact on someone's mental well-being.
Exactly. And what's so fascinating is that this definition helps us grasp the true scale of the problem, which, according to the World Health Organization, is absolutely staggering.
Okay, I'm bracing myself. Hit me with the stats.
Well, the WHO estimates that somewhere between 10% to a jaw-dropping, 69% of women globally have experienced physical violence from a male partner at some point in their lives.
Whoa, that range is huge. But even at the lower end, that's still a terrifying number of people. And I'm guessing this isn't just happening in one corner of the world, right?
Sadly, no. It's a global problem present in every country, every culture, and every socioeconomic class. Our sources really drive home that point. Gender-based violence knows no boundaries.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the numbers. But I keep thinking about the individual stories behind those statistics. The sources do a great job of painting this vivid picture of how this violence ripples outward, impacting not just individuals, but entire communities.
You're absolutely right. Take, for instance, the economic consequences. Women who experience violence are less likely to hold jobs, more likely to live in poverty, and face huge hurdles in escaping that cycle. It's a domino effect that can be incredibly difficult to break free from.
And then there's the fear. Imagine living with the constant threat of violence hanging over you. It limits women's participation in public life, makes it harder to get an education, and keeps them from contributing to community development projects. They're essentially being held back in so many ways.
One of the most heartbreaking things our sources highlight is the connection between harassment and abuse and low female enrollment or high dropout rates in schools, especially in developing countries.
It's tragic. Education should be the key to a brighter future, but for so many girls, schools become yet another place where they're vulnerable.
And we can't forget the health consequences. We're talking about increased risk of physical injuries, chronic pain, reproductive health issues, and long-term mental health challenges like PTSD and depression. The toll on a person's well-being can be devastating.
Yeah, it sounds like the consequences go far beyond the immediate act of violence itself. There's this ripple effect that impacts every aspect of a person's life.
Exactly. And what makes it even harder to address is that so much of this violence goes unreported. Think about it. You've got the shame, the fear of repercussions from your abuser, and in some cultures, the sad reality that abuse has become normalized.
It's like a hidden epidemic.
Yeah.
Which makes getting an accurate picture of the problem even more difficult. And then you have the challenges of collecting data in conflict zones and developing countries, where resources are limited and fear of speaking out is even greater.
It's a complex problem to track and quantify. But even with the limitations, the data we do have paints a pretty grim picture. So to really understand this issue, we need to break down the different types of gender-based violence that exist.
Okay, let's unpack that. Where do we even begin?
Well, our sources divide into two main categories: harmful traditional practices and other forms of violence. Let's start with the traditional practices, which are often deeply ingrained in cultural norms and incredibly difficult to eradicate.
Okay, I'm ready to dive in. What kind of practices are we talking about?
Think about abduction, which is still practiced in some cultures. It involves taking a girl as a wife by force, often with the consent of village elders who pressure families into these forced marriages. In some cases, it might be viewed as a cultural tradition, but it's a clear violation of human rights.
That's just awful. I remember reading in our sources about Ethiopia, where you actually have these conflicting laws surrounding abduction. It seems like there's this real tension between upholding tradition and protecting women and girls.
You hit the nail on the head there. It's a perfect example of how deeply embedded these practices can be, and how challenging it is to navigate legal systems that may not fully address the complexities of the situation.
Okay. What other harmful practices are there?
Well, one that's incredibly disturbing is female genital mutilation, or FGM. This involves cutting and removing parts or all of the female genitalia, usually without anesthetic. It's a procedure that can have severe health consequences, both physically and psychologically.
You know what really stuck with me from the sources is the long-term trauma FGM inflicts on survivors. It's not just a physical wound, it's a violation that impacts their sense of self, their relationships, and their overall well-being for years to come.
Absolutely. And while it has been criminalized in many countries, including Ethiopia, enforcing these laws and changing deeply held cultural beliefs remains a massive challenge.
Then there's dowry abuse, which is primarily an issue in India. I was shocked to learn about how common it is for women to be abused, often burned or even stoned to death, simply because their dowry wasn't deemed sufficient by their husband's family.
It's horrifying. And the saddest part is these cases are often disguised as accidents or suicides, which makes it even harder to hold the perpetrators accountable.
Our sources also mention honor killings, another tragic practice that's sadly prevalent in certain parts of the world. It's a stark reminder of how deeply patriarchal beliefs can fuel violence and control over women.
And we can't forget about early enforced marriage, which robs girls of their childhoods, their education, and the right to choose their own partners. These practices often trap them in abusive situations with little hope of escape.
It's clear that these harmful traditional practices have devastating consequences, but it sounds like there are other forms of gender-based violence that extend beyond these deeply ingrained customs.
You're absolutely right. There's a whole spectrum of violence that we need to understand. And unfortunately, many of these forms are far more common than people realize.
Okay, I'm ready to hear more. What other types of violence should we be aware of?
Well, one that we absolutely need to discuss is rape. It's any forced, unwanted sexual intercourse. And something that often gets overlooked or even dismissed is the very real issue of marital rape.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I was looking at the source material from Ethiopia, and they have these laws that criminalize rape. But there's this specific exclusion for marital rape. It seems like such a contradiction.
Yeah, it really highlights how, even within legal systems, there's this struggle to recognize and address the full spectrum of violence that women can experience, even within marriage. But it's not just rape that we need to be aware of. There's also the horrific reality of forced prostitution.
Forced prostitution being when someone is coerced or controlled and made to engage in sexual activity against their will.
Exactly. And it's something that's been recognized as an international crime since 1949, with the UN Convention for the Suppression of the Traffic in Persons, and even in Ethiopia, there are laws in the books against it. But enforcing those laws and tackling the root causes that make people vulnerable to this kind of exploitation remains a massive challenge.
And speaking of exploitation, our sources also went into trafficking, which, as I understand it, involves recruiting, transporting, and essentially trapping people for forced labor, sexual exploitation, or other forms of abuse.
It's a modern-day form of slavery that disproportionately targets women and children. It's a heartbreaking reality. And while Ethiopia does have laws against trafficking, it's a problem that persists, especially given the difficult economic conditions that many people face.
It's hard to believe that this kind of exploitation is still happening in the 21st century. You know, another form of violence that our sources highlighted, and one that I think a lot of people can relate to, is sexual harassment. It's something that happens in workplaces, in schools, and really anywhere where there are power dynamics at play.
Yeah, it's pervasive, and it often thrives on this imbalance of power, where someone uses their position or authority to intimidate or coerce others into unwanted sexual advances or behaviors. It can create a hostile environment that makes it difficult for people to feel safe and respected.
The source material on Ethiopia mentions that even though they have some laws around sexual harassment, the legal protections are actually pretty limited. It makes you wonder how many people are suffering in silence because they don't feel like they have any recourse.
It's a real problem. And then, of course, we have to talk about domestic violence, which is probably the most common form of gender-based violence. This is any type of violence that's perpetrated by an intimate partner or other family members.
And domestic violence doesn't always look the same. It can be physical or sexual assault,
Mm.
but it can also be emotional, psychological, or even financial abuse.
Right, it's about power and control. The abuser uses various tactics to manipulate and dominate their victim, often isolating them from support networks and making it even harder for them to escape the situation.
And what's so insidious about it is that it often takes place behind closed doors, hidden from view. It can be hard to detect and even harder for victims to speak out.
Absolutely, and it requires a multifaceted approach to both prevention and intervention.
Yeah.
So we've covered a lot of ground here today. We've defined gender-based violence, we've explored its many forms and its devastating consequences. But I think the big question on everyone's mind is, what now? Where do we go from here?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? What can we actually do to address this issue? I mean, it feels so overwhelming, like this massive global problem with such deep roots. Where do we even begin?
You're right, it is a complex issue. But I think the first step is recognizing the magnitude of the problem. We have to move beyond simply acknowledging that it exists and really start grappling with the systemic inequalities that contribute to it.
So we're talking about going beyond the surface level, right? We need to look at the root causes, the social and cultural factors that allow this violence to persist.
Exactly. And that means unpacking some uncomfortable truths about patriarchy, gender stereotypes, and how power imbalances create an environment where violence against women and individuals of other genders is not only tolerated, but sometimes even excused.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. It's not just about individual acts of violence. It's about the broader systems that allow this to happen.
You've hit the nail on the head. We have to dismantle those systems if we want to see real change. And that requires a multi-pronged approach.
Okay, break it down for me. What does that look like in practice?
Well, first and foremost, we need strong legal frameworks. And I'm not just talking about laws on the books. I'm talking about laws that are actually enforced and that hold perpetrators accountable for their actions. We need a justice system that's sensitive to the needs of survivors, and that provides them with real protection.
So legal reform is crucial, but it sounds like we need to go beyond that as well, right?
Absolutely. Legal solutions alone won't solve the problem. We need to invest in prevention strategies that address the root causes of gender-based violence.
That's interesting. What would those prevention strategies look like?
Well, education and awareness campaigns are essential. We have to challenge those harmful gender stereotypes, promote respectful relationships, and teach young people about consent and healthy boundaries.
I love that. It's about changing the narrative, shifting the culture so that violence is no longer accepted as the norm.
Exactly. And we can't forget about the critical need to support survivors. This means ensuring they have access to medical care, counseling, and safe shelters if they need to flee a dangerous situation.
It's about empowering them to rebuild their lives and to know that they're not alone.
And it's about helping them navigate the often complex legal system so they can access justice and hold their abusers accountable.
But, as we're talking about solutions, I can't help but think about the role of men and boys in this movement. They can't just be bystanders in this fight, right?
Absolutely not. Engaging men and boys as allies is crucial. We need them to step up and challenge those harmful norms and behaviors that contribute to gender-based violence.
I couldn't agree more. We need men holding other men accountable, calling out sexist jokes, interrupting harmful behavior, and speaking out against violence whenever they see it. Yeah, it's about promoting positive masculinity and having strong role models who embody respect, equality, and nonviolence. So we've talked about all these different approaches, but I'm sure a lot of people listening are wondering, what can I actually do about this? How can one person make a difference?
That's a fantastic question. And it's one we should all be asking ourselves. Because the truth is, there are so many ways to get involved and to make a difference, even in small ways.
Okay, I'm all ears. Give me some actionable steps, because I think a lot of people are looking for concrete ways to help.
Well, for starters, educate yourself. The more you understand about gender-based violence, the better equipped you'll be to challenge it in your own life and in your community. Read books, listen to podcasts like The Deep Dive, attend workshops, and most importantly, talk to people about this issue. Start those conversations.
And don't be afraid to speak up when you see something that's not right. Challenge those sexist jokes. Call out harassment. Support survivors. And let people know that this kind of behavior is not acceptable. Even small actions can have a ripple effect.
You can also volunteer your time or donate to organizations that are working to combat gender-based violence. There are so many amazing groups doing incredible work on the ground, providing support services, advocating for policy changes, and raising awareness. Every little bit helps.
And don't underestimate the power of your vote. Support candidates who prioritize this issue and who are committed to enacting policies that protect survivors and hold abusers accountable. It's about using your voice and your influence to create a world where everyone feels safe and respected. This is a fight that requires all of us to be engaged and to work together for change.
As we're talking about solutions, I'm struck by something you said earlier about gender-based violence not just being a problem out there, but also something that exists within our own communities, families, and even within ourselves. What did you mean by that?
It's a point that I think is often overlooked. We tend to focus on the external factors, but we can't ignore the role of our own biases and assumptions, because the reality is we all have a part to play in either perpetuating or dismantling the systems that allow this violence to thrive. You're right, it's easy to point fingers outward, but we also need to take a hard look in the mirror.
Exactly. It's about acknowledging that we all have biases, whether conscious or unconscious, that shape how we see the world and how we interact with others. We need to be willing to examine those biases, to have those uncomfortable conversations, and to hold ourselves accountable for our actions.
So it's about personal responsibility, right? It's about recognizing that change starts with each of us.
You got it. And it's a journey, not a destination. There's always more to learn, more work to do, and more ways to grow.
This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about, and I hope it's doing the same for our listeners.
It really has. And, it's not always easy to confront such difficult topics, but it's through awareness and understanding that we can start to create real change.
That's so true. And, as we wrap up, I keep coming back to something you said earlier about gender-based violence not just being a problem out there, but also something that exists within ourselves. It's a powerful thought, and it really resonated with me.
It's a point I feel strongly about. We often focus on external factors, but we can't ignore the role of our own biases and assumptions in perpetuating this problem.
It's almost like we have a collective responsibility to look inward and examine how we might be contributing to these harmful systems, even unintentional.
Exactly. It's about being willing to challenge our own beliefs, having those uncomfortable conversations, and holding ourselves accountable for our actions.
It's like you said earlier, it's a journey we're all constantly learning and unlearning, and it's an ongoing process.
And it requires empathy, compassion, and a willingness to listen to and believe survivors. Their voices are so important in this conversation.
One thing that does give me hope is the growing global movement to address this issue. It feels like more and more people are speaking out, demanding justice, and working to create a world free from violence.
It's inspiring to see that momentum building. From grassroots organizations to international institutions, there's a collective effort to challenge the status quo and create lasting change.
And that change starts with each of us, right? It's the conversations we have, the choices we make, and the actions we take every day that contribute to a safer, more just world.
Absolutely. So as we conclude this deep dive, I want to leave you with a thought-provoking question. Given everything you've learned today, how do you think gender-based violence is interconnected with broader issues of equality, poverty, and access to education?
That's such a great question. It's a reminder that this issue doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's deeply intertwined with systemic inequalities that impact all aspects of society.
Exactly. And it's by addressing those broader issues, challenging those deeply ingrained power imbalances, that we can truly create a world where everyone, regardless of gender, feels safe, respected, and empowered.
Listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey. We know it's a heavy topic, but it's an incredibly important one. We hope this deep dive has been informative, thought-provoking, and most importantly, a call to action.
Remember, knowledge is power. And by understanding the complexities of gender-based violence, we can all play a part in creating a more just and equitable world for all.